The first thing Commander Zexay noticed about humans wasn't their strange bipedal stance, or their peculiar lack of proper armor plating. It wasn't even their disturbing habit of showing their teeth when they were pleased, which every civilized species knew was a threat display. No. The first thing he noticed was how they looked at him. Not with fear, as was proper when facing a Keth-Moran warrior whose reputation preceded him across 17 star systems. Not with respect, though his service record and battle honors should have demanded it. They looked at him with something far more unsettling, curiosity, as if he were some interesting puzzle they were eager to solve. "So you're the famous Commander Zexay," the human general had said during their first meeting aboard the Coalition flagship Harmony of Spheres. The man was smaller than Zexay had expected, lacking the impressive physical presence that marked great warriors among every species he'd encountered. General Marcus Chen stood barely chest-high to the Keth-Moran commander, his skin an unremarkable shade of brown, his dark hair cropped short in what humans called military regulation. Nothing about him suggested the tactical genius that had supposedly turned the tide at 3 separate engagements against the Devourers. Zexay had clicked his mandibles in what he hoped passed for politeness among these strange creatures. "General Chen, your reputation precedes you, though I confess your species continues to puzzle my analysts." "How so?" Chen had asked, and there it was again. That look of genuine interest, as if Zexay's opinion actually mattered to him. Among the Keth-Moran, subordinates deferred to superiors. Among humans, apparently, everyone was expected to contribute to the conversation. "Your tactical approaches defy conventional military doctrine," Zexay had explained, his translator unit working to convert his chittering speech into the humans' barbarous collection of grunts and vowels they called English. "You consistently choose strategies that maximize casualties among your own forces. By any reasonable calculation, your species should have been extinct millennia ago." Chen had actually smiled at that, baring those unsettling white teeth. "Commander, I think you're confusing recklessness with determination. We don't seek out death. We just refuse to let the fear of it paralyze us." At the time, Zexay had dismissed this as typical human bravado. Every species claimed to be fearless when safely aboard their capital ships, surrounded by shields and weapons and the endless black of space between them and their enemies. It was easy to be philosophical about courage when death was theoretical. That was before Thermopylae Station. Now, 2 standard years later, sitting in Dr. Yildara's office with its soothing purple lighting and the faint scent of Centaurian calming spores in the air, Zexay wondered if he had ever truly understood what courage meant before he met the humans. "You're tensing again, Commander," Dr. Yildara observed, her 4 eyes tracking the bio-readings from the sensors attached to his carapace. The Zolarian therapist had worked with traumatized soldiers from dozens of species, but Zexay suspected he was her first case involving what the medical text clinically termed post-contact psychological stress disorder related to human behavioral patterns. "I was thinking about our first meeting," Zexay admitted, forcing his secondary arms to uncurl from the defensive posture they'd automatically assumed. "General Chen, I thought I understood him then. And now?" Zexay's laugh was a dry, chittering sound. "Now I think understanding humans is like trying to map the surface of a star while standing on it. The closer you get, the more it burns." Dr. Bryan. Yildara made a note on her datapad. In the early sessions, her clinical detachment had irritated him. Now he found it oddly comforting. At least one being in the galaxy still approached problems with logical, rational analysis. "Tell me about the battle plan," she said. "The one General Chen proposed for Thermopylae Station." Zexay's mandibles clicked involuntarily. Even now, the memory of that briefing sent tremors through his nervous system. He could still see the holographic display showing the station's position at the edge of the Kepler Nebula, a vital refueling depot that controlled access to 3 major hyperspace lanes. The Devourers had been advancing on it for weeks, their massive bioships consuming everything in their path like a living plague. "The station was indefensible," Zexay said, repeating the words he'd spoken in that briefing room aboard the Harmony of Spheres. Any competent military analyst could see that. The Devourers had 47 capital ships, including 3 of their massive hive queens. We had 12 ships, most of them already damaged from previous engagements. The station itself was essentially a civilian installation. Fuel processors, merchant habitation modules, minimal defensive systems. What was the Coalition's plan? Evacuation and strategic withdrawal. Save what we could. Fall back to a more defensible position. Make our stand at the Rigel defense grid, where we'd have the advantage of prepared positions and orbital platforms. Zexhai paused, his primary arms gesturing in the Kathmaran equivalent of a shrug. It was the logical choice, the only choice that made tactical sense. But General Chen disagreed. The memories rushed back despite Zexhai's attempts to contain them. Chen, standing at the briefing room's central hollow projector, his hands clasped behind his back, staring at the tactical display with those unnervingly focused human eyes. The other coalition commanders, Kethmoran, Solarian, Christine, even a few of the nomadic Void Singers, all nodding in agreement with the evacuation plan, all except Chen. The general said something that still echoes in my mind. Zexhai told Dr. Poro. Yildara, he said, sometimes the only way to win is to refuse to lose. At the time, I thought it was just human nonsense, a contradiction disguised as wisdom. What did he propose instead? Zexhai felt his carapace start to perspire, the evolutionary response his species had developed for extreme stress. He wanted to evacuate the civilian population, yes. But he also wanted to reinforce the station with every available ground combat unit, turn it into a fortress, and hold it against the Devourer fleet. The other commander's response? What you'd expect. Admiral Corrin called it suicide. Commander Vashti ran probability calculations showing a 0.3% chance of success. I myself pointed out that even if we somehow managed to repel the initial assault, we'd be trapped with no avenue for retreat and no hope of reinforcement. Zexhai's voice dropped to barely above a whisper. Chen just looked at us all and said, "Good, then they'll know we're serious. Doctor." Yildara's manipulator appendages worked her datapad, recording every nuance of his response. But the plan was approved. Admiral Corrin held overall command, but the Coalition Council had given Chen significant autonomy in tactical decisions involving human forces, and somehow, I still don't understand how, he convinced enough of us to support a modified version of his proposal. Zexhai shook his head, a gesture he'd unconsciously picked up from the humans. We would make a fighting withdrawal from the outer defenses, draw the Devourers into the station's interior where their numerical advantage would be reduced, then hold key choke points for as long as possible. How long did the analyst predict you could hold? 18 hours. 24 at the absolute maximum, assuming perfect coordination and minimal equipment failures. Zexhai's primary arms began to shake again. We held for 6 days. The silence in the office stretched for several moments before Dr. Yildara spoke again. Tell me about the first day. And there it was, the moment when Zexhai's carefully constructed understanding of warfare had begun to crumble. He closed his 4 eyes and let the memories flow, no longer trying to fight them. The Devourer fleet had arrived exactly on schedule, their bioships sliding out of hyperspace like massive tumors against the starfield. 47 capital vessels, each one a living nightmare of chitinous armor and organic weapon systems. The smallest of them dwarfed the Coalition's largest battlecruiser. The 3 Hive Queens at the center of their formation were each the size of small moons, their surfaces writhing with the movement of countless smaller craft gestating in their bellies. Zexhai had been aboard the station's command center when the first wave of Devourer attack craft launched. Thousands of them, each one a fusion of biological tissue and malevolent intelligence, screaming through space toward Thermopylae's defensive perimeter. The station's automated defense systems had opened fire immediately, filling the void with streams of plasma and coherent energy. But there were simply too many targets. Outer ring is compromised, the Christine sensor operator had reported, its crystal matrix body refracting the command center's emergency lighting into prismatic patterns. Estimate 40% of the first wave neutralized, but the remainder are breaking through. Admiral Corrin, commanding from his flagship in the small Coalition fleet, had immediately begun issuing retreat orders. All non-essential personnel to evacuation pods. Combat units prepare for fighting withdrawal to secondary positions. But then Chen's voice had cut across the command channel, calm and steady despite the chaos erupting around them. Negative on the withdrawal, Admiral. All human units are moving to forward positions. Zexhai had watched in disbelief as the human soldiers did exactly the opposite of what any sane military force would do. Instead of falling back from the breached outer defenses, they advanced. Squads of human marines, their power armor making them look like metallic insects, rushed toward the very sections where Devourer forces were breaking through. General Chen! Admiral Corrin's voice carried a sharp edge of command authority. Your forces are advancing directly into a superior enemy concentration. You're violating basic tactical doctrine. Roger that, Admiral, Chen had replied, and HFY could hear weapons fire beginning to echo through the communication channel. Doctrine is what you use when you're fighting someone who follows the same rules you do. These things don't read our textbooks. What happened next had defied every principle of military science HFY had learned in 3 centuries of warfare. The human forces, instead of establishing defensive positions and waiting for the enemy to come to them, had charged directly into the advancing devourer swarm. Not a careful, coordinated advance with proper support and covering fire, but an actual charge. Soldiers yelling battle cries that their translators couldn't properly convert, firing their weapons as they ran towards certain death. They should have been slaughtered in the first 5 minutes, HFY told Dr. Yildara, his voice hollow with remembered shock. The Devourers had them outnumbered, outgunned, and surrounded. By every tactical analysis, the humans were committing elaborate suicide, but they weren't. No. They were doing something else entirely, something I didn't have a word for in my language. HFY paused, searching for the right way to explain what he'd witnessed. They were refusing to accept the mathematics of defeat. The first hint that something unprecedented was happening came when the Devourer advance suddenly slowed. Their attack formations, which had been maintaining perfect coordination as they swept through the station's outer defenses, began to waver and bunch up. At first, HFY had assumed it was a temporary tactical adjustment. The creatures were simply adapting to the unexpected human response. Then the casualty reports started coming in, and nothing made sense. Human Squad 7 reporting 30% casualties, continuing advance on Corridor 7. Alpha, one voice had crackled over the command channel. Second platoon has lost contact with Bravo Company. Another reported, pushing forward to re-establish link. This is Sergeant Martinez with 3rd Squad. We're surrounded in Section 12, but we've got their attention. Send reinforcements through the maintenance tunnels. Every report should have been describing the final moments of doomed soldiers. Instead, they sounded like progress reports from a successful offensive. More disturbing still were the reports from the other coalition species fighting alongside the humans. Commander HFY, one of his own Cathmoran squad leaders, had radioed in during the 3rd hour of fighting. The humans in our sector they're not fighting like anything I've seen before. Explain. Sir, they take wounds that should incapacitate them and keep fighting. I watched a human marine lose his primary weapon arm to a devourer slasher form, and he immediately drew a sidearm with his remaining hand and continued the attack. When his ammunition ran out, he began using his weapon as a club. HFY had assumed this was typical post-combat hyperbole, until he began receiving similar reports from commanders throughout the station. Humans fighting with broken bones. Humans who refused medical evacuation until the battle was won. Humans who somehow kept advancing, even when tactical computer models showed their positions as overrun and eliminated. They weren't ignoring the odds, he told Dr. Yildara. They were aware of them. They just didn't care. It was as if they'd decided that mathematics was optional when it came to survival. The therapist made another note. How did this affect the other coalition forces? That was perhaps the most disturbing part of the entire experience. HFY had commanded multi-species units before, and he understood the careful balance required to maintain morale and cohesion when different evolutionary psychologies were forced to work together. What he'd never anticipated was how the human approach to warfare would spread to the other species like some kind of psychological contagion. By the end of the first day, my own Cathmaran warriors were charging alongside the humans, he admitted. Christine units that normally required precise tactical coordination were making independent, aggressive advances. Even the Void Singers, who are perhaps the most cautious species in known space, began taking risks that their own command protocols should have prevented. The humans were leading by example. More than that, they were demonstrating a completely different paradigm for what was possible. HFY felt his breathing begin to accelerate as the memories pressed closer to the surface. When you've spent your entire military career calculating acceptable loss ratios and probability matrices, and then you watch beings who simply refuse to accept that they can lose, it changes something fundamental in how you understand conflict. Dr. Yildara's sensors registered his increasing stress levels, and she triggered a mild sedative release through the chair's medical systems. We can stop here if you need to. No. HFY's mandibles clicked with determination. I need to tell this. All of it. Because what happened on that station, it wasn't just a battle. It was the moment I realized that every assumption my species has made about warfare, about courage, about the nature of combat itself, might be completely wrong. The sedatives took effect, and his trembling subsided slightly. But the memories remained, as vivid and disturbing as the day they'd been burned into his consciousness. 6 days of fighting that had redefined his understanding of what it meant to be a warrior. 6 days of watching humans do the impossible, not through superior technology or numbers, but through sheer, stubborn refusal to acknowledge defeat. And now, 2 years later, he still woke up every sleep cycle, wondering if courage was something his species had simply never learned to recognize. The second day at Thermopylae Station began with what should have been a complete tactical collapse. The Devourer forces had managed to breach the main defensive perimeter in 7 different locations overnight, and their bioforms were spreading through the station's interior like a living infection. Standard coalition doctrine called for immediate evacuation at this point. The position was clearly untenable, and any commander who continued to hold would be condemning his forces to certain death. General Chen had looked at the tactical displays showing red markers spreading across the station's schematics and calmly ordered breakfast for his command staff. Sir, Major Rodriguez, one of Chen's human subordinates, had approached the general with a steaming cup of the dark liquid the humans called coffee. The fact that they were maintaining normal meal schedules while surrounded by carnivorous aliens still struck Zexai as either admirably disciplined or completely insane. Latest casualty reports from the overnight fighting. Chen had accepted the cup and reviewed the datapad without any change in his expression. 43 human Marines killed, 67 wounded severely enough to require medical evacuation, and ammunition reserves down to 60% of combat loads. By any rational analysis, it was time to retreat. Pass the word to all unit commanders, Chen had said instead. We're implementing Operation Marathon. Zexai, monitoring the command frequency from his own position coordinating Keth Moran forces in Section C, had felt his carapace begin to perspire again. Operation Marathon wasn't in any of the tactical databases he'd studied. It sounded like another piece of human military improvisation, the kind that seemed to work despite violating every principle of sound strategy. General Chen, Admiral Corrin's voice cut across the communication channels. I'm reading massive Devourer concentrations moving toward your central positions. My tactical computers are showing complete encirclement within 4 hours. I strongly recommend immediate evacuation to the fleet. Negative, Admiral, Chen had replied, his voice carrying that same unnaturally calm tone that was beginning to unnerve Zexai more than the sounds of battle itself. We're exactly where we want to be. General, you're outnumbered 15-1 in your current position. Yes, sir. That means they can only attack us from 15 directions instead of the unlimited approaches they had in open space. We consider that an improvement. That was when Zexai began to understand that humans didn't just think differently about combat. They thought differently about reality itself. Where every other species saw an impossible tactical situation, they saw an opportunity. Where military logic demanded retreat, they saw reasons to advance. It was as if they operated according to some alternative version of physics, where desperation somehow transformed into strength. The first indication that Operation Marathon was something unprecedented came when human engineers began destroying their own equipment. Not the random sabotage of a retreating force, but carefully planned demolitions that collapsed certain corridors while reinforcing others. Within 2 hours, they transformed the station's interior into a maze, where the Devourer's numerical advantage became a liability. They're turning the entire station into a weapon, Commander Vashti had observed during one of the brief tactical briefings they managed between waves of enemy attacks. The Christine officer's normally logical thought processes seemed as strained as everyone else's. Instead of defending fixed positions, they're using the infrastructure itself as part of their battle plan. Zexai had watched the engineering reports with growing amazement. The humans weren't just adapting to the station's layout, they were actively modifying it to force the Devourers into kill zones and choke points. Maintenance shafts became sniper nests. Storage areas were converted into ammunition depots and medical stations. Even the station's artificial gravity generators were being reprogrammed to create tactical advantages. But the most disturbing part wasn't their engineering cleverness. Zexai told Dr. Yildada, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. It was how they fought when the plan started working. The memories of that second day still made his nervous system spike with adrenaline. He could see it all again. The first successful human ambush in Corridor 7. Delta, where a squad of Marines had used jury-rigged explosive charges to collapse a section of the station's superstructure onto a Devourer hunting pack. The aliens' surprise had been complete, but what happened next had defied every assumption about combat psychology. Instead of consolidating their position or falling back to regroup, the human squad had immediately advanced into the rubble they'd just created. hunting for survivors to eliminate. Not the methodical clearing operation that military doctrine demanded, but something that looked more like predatory behavior. Sergeant Chen reporting successful ambush in 7 Delta. The squad leader had radioed to the command center. Estimated 12 hostiles eliminated, advancing to search for wounded. Negative, Sergeant. Major Rodriguez had responded immediately. Hold position and await reinforcement before conducting search operations. Sir, we can hear at least 3 of them still moving in the debris. If we wait for backup, they'll either escape or call for support. There had been a brief pause on the command channel before General Chen's voice cut in. Sergeant, this is General Chen. What's your ammunition status? 70%, sir. More than enough to finish the job. Then finish it. Rodriguez, redirect 3rd Platoon to provide covering fire from the upper levels. Zexay had listened to this exchange with mounting horror. The humans were actively choosing to engage wounded, potentially desperate enemies in close quarters rather than following the safe, logical approach of containment and systematic elimination. It violated every principle of force protection he'd ever learned. But then the follow-up reports began coming in, and once again the humans were proving that their version of military logic worked even when it shouldn't. 7. Delta cleared, all hostiles eliminated, no friendly casualties. Sergeant Chen reported 20 minutes later. We've secured their bioammunition and identified what looks like a communication node in one of the carcasses. Outstanding, Sergeant. Can you extract the node? Already done, sir. Looks like they were coordinating at least 4 other hunting packs in this sector. We've got their locations and movement patterns. What followed was a systematic hunting operation that turned the humans from defenders into predators. Using intelligence gathered from eliminated Devourer forces, human squads began stalking their enemies through the station's modified corridors with a precision that bordered on supernatural. But it wasn't their tactical effectiveness that disturbed HFY, it was their emotional state while they did it. They were enjoying themselves, he told Dr. Yildara, his mandibles clicking with remembered confusion. Not the satisfaction of successful combat operations, but something deeper. They had found their natural environment. The evidence had been in their communications, in the way their voices changed as the day progressed. The initial tension and uncertainty gave way to something that sounded almost like enthusiasm. Human squads began requesting permission to advance to new sectors, volunteering for the most dangerous reconnaissance missions, competing with each other for the highest kill counts. Bravo Company, reporting 17 confirmed eliminations in Section 9. One voice had crackled over the command net. Charlie Company's got 23 in Section 12. Another had responded immediately. This is Delta Company. Anybody want to make this interesting? We're moving on Section 15, and we've got eyes on at least 30 hostiles. General Chen had allowed this informal competition to continue, apparently understanding something about human psychology that HFY was only beginning to grasp. The more dangerous the situation became, the more motivated the human forces seemed to be. It was as if combat wasn't something they endured, but something they thrived on. The turning point came during the 3rd major Devourer assault wave. The aliens had finally adapted to the station's modified layout and were pushing through the human choke points with coordinated attacks from multiple directions. For the first time since the battle began, human positions were actually falling back under enemy pressure. HFY had been coordinating his own Kethmoran forces in a desperate attempt to plug a gap in the defensive line when he heard General Chen's voice cut across all command frequencies with an announcement that still haunted his dreams. All coalition forces, this is General Chen with a general tactical update. Enemy forces have achieved local superiority in sectors 7, 12, and 15. Standard defensive doctrine would call for strategic withdrawal to secondary positions. A brief pause filled only with the sound of weapons fire and the chittering screams of dying devourers. However, I am implementing immediate offensive operations against all enemy concentrations. All human units will advance on enemy positions in 30 seconds. Coalition forces are requested to provide supporting fire and pursue fleeing hostiles. The silence that followed this announcement was broken only by Admiral Corrin's voice from the fleet. General, did you just order a general advance against superior enemy forces? Affirmative, Admiral. We've decided that defense is overrated. What happened next would be studied in military academies for generations, assuming anyone survived to write the textbooks. Instead of falling back from positions under heavy assault, the human forces launched simultaneous attacks against every Devourer concentration on the station. Not careful, coordinated advances with proper preparation and support, but immediate assaults that began before the enemy forces could consolidate their recent gains. The psychological effect on the Devourers was immediate and devastating. Creatures that had been advancing confidently through the station's corridors suddenly found themselves under attack from directions they had just secured. The humans weren't just refusing to retreat, they were actively pursuing enemies that should have been pushing them back. It was like watching predators suddenly realize they'd been hunting other predators, HFY told Dr. Yuldara. The Devourer's entire tactical approach was based on overwhelming local resistance and then expanding from secure positions. But the humans never allowed them to establish secure positions. Every advance became a new vulnerability. The battle turned in less than an hour. Devourer forces that had been systematically clearing the station found themselves caught between advancing human squads and coalition forces that were suddenly taking tactical risks they'd never considered before. The careful, methodical alien advance became a chaotic running battle where their numerical superiority meant nothing. But the most disturbing aspect of the entire engagement was how the other coalition species began responding to human tactics. HFY found his own Kethmoran warriors abandoning their traditional defensive positions to pursue fleeing devourers. Christine units that normally required extensive coordination protocols were making independent decisions to support human advances. The humans weren't just changing the tactical situation, HFY explained. They were changing us. Making us think like them, fight like them. And the terrifying part was how natural it felt. By the end of the second day, the Devourer fleet had pulled back to regroup, and Thermopylae Station was still in coalition hands. The casualty reports showed losses that should have been catastrophic. Over 200 coalition personnel killed or wounded. Ammunition reserves down to critical levels. Major damage to the station's infrastructure and life support systems. General Chen had reviewed these reports and immediately began planning the next day's operations. Sir, Major Rodriguez had approached the general with obvious concern. The medical officers are requesting a minimum 12-hour rest period for the wounded. Engineering needs at least 8 hours to restore primary power to damaged sections. And our ammunition situation is becoming critical. Chen had looked up from the tactical displays where he was studying Devourer fleet positions and smiled that disturbing human expression. Major, what's our current casualty rate compared to initial projections? Rodriguez had consulted his datapad. Approximately 40% below worst-case scenarios, sir. And how many Devourer bioforms have we eliminated? Current estimates suggest over 3,000 confirmed kills. Outstanding. Pass the word to all unit commanders. We'll implement expanded patrol schedules starting at 0600. I want every sector of this station swept clean before they try another major assault. HFY had monitored this conversation with growing disbelief. The humans had just survived what should have been an annihilating defeat, and instead of consolidating their defensive position, they were planning to increase their operational tempo. It was madness disguised as military planning, but it was also working. That night, I couldn't enter hibernation cycle. HFY told Dr. Yuldara. I kept thinking about what I'd witnessed. Not just the tactical innovations or the successful defense. I kept thinking about how the humans had looked during the fighting. They weren't enduring combat. They were embracing it. And somehow, they were making the rest of us embrace it too. The therapist made extensive notes before responding. How did this realization affect your own performance? HFY felt his carapace begin to perspire again.
That's what frightened me most of all.
By the end of the second day, I was starting to think like them. Starting to see impossible tactical situations as opportunities instead of disasters. Starting to understand that courage isn't about calculating acceptable risks. It's about refusing to accept unacceptable outcomes. He paused, his 4 eyes focusing on something far beyond the walls of the therapy office. I was becoming something I didn't recognize, something more dangerous than I'd ever been before. And the most terrifying part was how much I was beginning to enjoy it. The third day at Thermopylae Station began with the Devourers doing something that shattered every assumption HFY had made about their behavior patterns. Instead of launching another massive assault or attempting to bypass the station entirely, they began broadcasting on standard coalition communication frequencies. The transmission came through at 0347 station time, cutting across all channels with a sound that made HFY's carapace ache. It wasn't the usual chittering howls that Devourer bioforms made during their attacks, but something structured, almost linguistic. The universal translator struggled with it for several minutes before producing a rough approximation in standard galactic. Human things. We offer cessation. Your kind shows interesting qualities. We would study these qualities. Cease resistance. We will consume quickly. The communication center fell silent except for the low hum of processing equipment. In 3 centuries of warfare against the Devourers, no coalition force had ever received anything resembling an offer of terms. The creatures simply arrived, consumed everything in their path, and moved on. The fact that they were attempting to communicate at all was unprecedented. General Chen had stood before the main communication console, hands clasped behind his back, studying the translation display with that same unnervingly calm expression he'd maintained throughout the battle. Around him, the command staff waited for his response. Even Admiral Corrin's voice from the fleet held a note of expectation. "General, this could be an opportunity to negotiate terms for the civilian evacuation." The Admiral's voice crackled over the command channel. They seemed to be offering some form of surrender protocol. Chen had nodded thoughtfully, then turned to his communication officer. "Lieutenant Santos, please transmit the following message on all frequencies." "Yes, sir." "To the Devourer fleet, thank you for your offer. We respectfully decline. We're having too much fun to stop now." The stunned silence that followed this response stretched for nearly 30 seconds before Lieutenant Santos found his voice. "Sir, should I actually transmit that message?"
"Word for word, Lieutenant."
Zexai had listened to this exchange with mounting horror. The humans had just been offered what amounted to a mercy killing by creatures that had never shown mercy to anyone, and Chen was treating it like a casual social invitation he was politely declining.
General Chen! Admiral Corrin's voice carried sharp concern.
"Perhaps we should consider, Admiral. With all due respect, we've moved beyond the point where surrender is tactically viable." Chen had interrupted. "These creatures came here expecting easy prey. Teaching them that human beings are neither easy nor prey is now a strategic necessity that extends far beyond this single engagement." The Devourer response had come within minutes, and it carried a tone that Zexai's translator rendered as something between confusion and anger. "Human things do not comprehend. You cannot victory. We are many. You are few. Mathematics proves your defeat." Chen had actually smiled at that, the terrifying human expression that showed those unsettling white teeth. "Lieutenant, please respond. Mathematics is a useful tool for beings who accept its limitations. We prefer to think of it as a starting point for negotiation. Sir, I'm not sure that's going to translate properly. Send it anyway, and add, 'Come and take the station if you think you're capable. We'll be waiting.'" What followed was not another massive assault or a renewed siege, but something that would haunt Zexai's dreams for the rest of his life. The Devourers began trying to understand the humans. The attacks that came throughout the third day were different from anything they'd attempted before. Instead of overwhelming force applied to achieve rapid conquest, the creatures began sending small, specialized units to probe human defensive positions and tactics. They were studying their enemies, trying to decode the psychology that allowed a vastly outnumbered force to not just survive, but thrive under impossible conditions. "They're learning from us," Major Rodriguez had observed during one of the tactical briefings. "Each attack pattern is more sophisticated than the last. They're adapting to our modifications of the station, countering our ambush tactics, even beginning to anticipate our movement patterns." "Good," Chen had replied. "That means they're starting to take us seriously. The question is whether they can learn fast enough to matter." Zexai had found this response deeply disturbing. The humans seemed pleased that their enemies were becoming more dangerous, as if the increased threat somehow validated their approach to combat. It suggested a psychological relationship with warfare that was fundamentally different from every other species he'd encountered. The first indication that the Devourer's new strategy was working came when human casualty rates began climbing steadily throughout the day. The random, overwhelming attacks of the first 2 days had been costly but predictable. These new, targeted assaults were systematically identifying and exploiting weaknesses in the human defensive network. Bravo Company has lost 2 squads in Section 7, Kane 1 report. Delta Company requesting immediate medical evacuation for 5 wounded, came another. Echo Company reporting ammunition critically low after extended engagement in Section 15. Each report represented coalition personnel who would not be returning to combat, and the mathematics of attrition were becoming increasingly clear. The humans had proven they could fight against impossible odds, but they couldn't replace losses while isolated on a damaged space station. But instead of adjusting their tactics to minimize casualties, the humans did something that violated every principle of military leadership Zexai had ever learned. They increased the operational tempo. "All unit commanders, this is General Chen." The announcement came over the command frequencies during the middle of the day's heaviest fighting. "The enemy is attempting to wear us down through systematic attrition. They're learning our patterns and exploiting our predictability. Effective immediately, all units will implement random aggressive patrols in enemy-held sectors. Sir, Major Rodriguez had protested immediately. Our forces are already stretched beyond recommended deployment ratios. Increasing patrol activity will accelerate casualty rates. Major, sitting in defensive positions and letting them study us will also accelerate casualty rates. The difference is that aggressive patrolling will accelerate their casualty rates even more. It was madness presented as logic, but Zexai was beginning to understand that human logic operated according to principles that made sense only when viewed from within their unique psychological framework. They weren't calculating the odds of success, they were calculating the odds of making their enemies pay an unacceptable price for victory. The effect of the increased patrol schedule was immediate and dramatic. Instead of allowing the Devourers to control the pace of engagement, human squads began stalking through the station's corridors in unpredictable patterns, turning every section into a potential battlefield. The careful, methodical alien reconnaissance became a series of running battles where their numerical advantage was neutralized by the confined space and the humans' intimate knowledge of the modified station layout. This is Patrol 7 reporting contact with hostile reconnaissance unit in Section 12. Came one transmission. Patrol 4 engaging enemy infiltration team in the maintenance levels. Came another. Patrol 11 requesting permission to pursue fleeing hostiles into Section 20. Looks like they're falling back toward a larger concentration. What disturbed Zexai most was how the other coalition species responded to this shift in tactics. His own Kethmoran warriors, who had been following human leadership with growing enthusiasm, began volunteering for the most dangerous patrol routes. Christine units started making independent tactical decisions that prioritized aggressive engagement over force preservation. Even the cautious Void Singers were taking risks that their traditional command protocols should have prevented. We weren't just fighting alongside the humans anymore. Zexai told Dr. Yildara, his voice hollow with remembered confusion. We were becoming like them, thinking like them, making decisions that prioritized victory over survival. The therapist made careful notes before responding. How did this psychological transformation manifest in your own behavior? Zexai felt his secondary arms begin to tremble as the memories surfaced. I started making choices that terrified me, not because they were wrong, but because they felt so completely right. The specific incident had occurred during the day's third major engagement, when a Devourer infiltration unit had managed to penetrate the station's central command sector. Standard protocols called for immediate lockdown and systematic clearing operations using overwhelming force to minimize risk to critical personnel. Instead, Zexai had found himself volunteering to lead a small, fast-moving team to hunt the infiltrators through the command sector's maze of corridors and technical spaces. Not because it was the safest option, but because it was the option most likely to eliminate the threat quickly and completely. Commander Zexai requesting permission to deploy Hunting Team Alpha in the command sector. He had radioed to the tactical center.
Commander, we have sufficient forces for standard clearing operations, Major Rodriguez had responded. No need to risk specialized personnel in close-quarters combat.
Major, standard clearing operations will take hours and allow the infiltrators to potentially sabotage critical systems.
My team can eliminate them in 30 minutes. There had been a brief pause before General Chen's voice cut in. Commander, what's your team composition? 6 volunteers, sir. 2 Kathmaran close combat specialists, 2 human marines, 1 Christine sensor operator, and 1 Void Singer for stealth coordination. Approved. Rodriguez, coordinate support from the tactical center and have medical teams standing by. What followed was 47 minutes of the most intense combat Zexai had ever experienced. Not because of the danger he'd faced more lethal situations many times in his career, but because of how natural it felt to be hunting sentient beings through darkened corridors with the specific intent of killing them efficiently and quietly. The Devourer infiltrators were skilled and desperate, using every advantage the command sector's complex layout provided. But Zexai's mixed-species team moved through the area like a single predatory organism, each member's abilities complementing the others in ways that seemed almost instinctive. Contact in Technical Bay 7. Sergeant Williams, one of the human marines, had whispered over their private communication frequency. Confirmed. Chivold, the Christine sensor operator, had responded immediately. 3 hostiles, moving toward the primary data core. Intercept route through Maintenance Corridor C. Zexai had decided without conscious thought. Void Singer Harmony provides covering silence. Kethmoran teams take point positions. Humans provide ranged support. The engagement had lasted less than 90 seconds, But those seconds had revealed something about coalition forces that Zexai hadn't known existed. When different species work together not just as allies but as components of a unified hunting pack, their combined capabilities became something greater than the sum of their individual parts. All hostiles eliminated, he had reported to the tactical center. No friendly casualties, command sector secured. Outstanding work, Commander, Chen had responded. How did your team coordinate so effectively? Most mixed species units require extensive preparation for complex operations. Zexai had paused before answering, trying to understand what had happened himself. General, I think we stopped thinking about species differences and started thinking about the mission. The humans provided aggression and adaptability. The Kethmoran provided close combat effectiveness. The Christine provided sensor capability. And the Voidsinger provided stealth coordination. We became complementary. Exactly. You became a team instead of a committee. That exchange had crystallized something that had been building in Zexai's mind throughout the battle. The human approach to warfare wasn't just about refusing to accept defeat. It was about creating synergistic relationships that multiplied individual capabilities. They didn't just fight harder than other species. They made everyone around them fight better. But this realization came with a psychological cost that Zexai was only beginning to understand. By the end of the third day, I no longer recognized myself, he told Dr. Yildera. I was making tactical decisions that prioritized mission success over personal survival. I was volunteering for dangerous assignments not because duty required it, but because I wanted to. I was becoming something that felt more effective, more capable, more alive than I'd ever been before. The therapist's sensors registered increasing stress indicators, and this transformation troubled you? It terrified me.
It terrified me.
Because I couldn't tell whether I was becoming a better soldier or simply becoming more like a human, and I wasn't sure there was a meaningful difference. The third day had ended with another successful defense, but at a cost that was becoming increasingly clear. Not just the mounting casualties or the dwindling supply reserves, but the psychological transformation that was affecting every coalition species involved in the battle. They were all becoming something different from what they had been before encountering human approaches to warfare. Something more effective, something more dangerous, something that might not be entirely compatible with the peaceful, rational civilization they had been fighting to defend. The fourth day at Thermopylae Station began with silence. Not the peaceful quiet of a lull in battle, but the ominous absence of communication from the Devourer fleet. For 18 hours, the creatures that had been launching increasingly sophisticated attacks against the station simply stopped all offensive operations. Their bioships maintained their positions at the edge of the system, but no attack craft launched, no probing raids materialized, and no communication attempts were made. General Chen had stood in the command center studying the tactical displays with an expression that Zexai was learning to recognize as deeply troubling. The human commander wasn't relieved by the respite. He was suspicious of it. Major Rodriguez, Chen had called to his second-in-command. What's our current intelligence assessment of enemy intentions? All conventional indicators suggest they're regrouping for a major assault, sir, Rodriguez had replied, consulting his datapad. Fleet positioning is consistent with preparation for overwhelming offensive action, but the timeline doesn't match their previous patterns. Explain. They've had sufficient time to coordinate and launch at least 6 separate major attacks since they ceased offensive operations. Instead, they're maintaining position and conducting what appears to be extensive internal communication between their bioships. Zexai had monitored this conversation with growing unease. In his experience, Devourers didn't engage in extended planning sessions or strategic analysis. They consumed, they moved on, they consumed again. The fact that they were taking time to think suggested they had encountered something that required unprecedented consideration. They're trying to understand us, Chen had concluded. The question is whether they figured out something we need to worry about. The answer came at 1347 station time, when the Devourers launched something that violated every assumption about their capabilities. Instead of another wave of attack craft or another attempt at infiltration, they sent a single unarmed bioform to dock with the station's main airlock. Sir, we're receiving a transmission from the approaching vessel, Lieutenant Santos had reported. It's requesting permission to board for... The translation is approximate, but it appears to be requesting diplomatic contact. The stunned silence in the command center stretched for several moments before Admiral Corrin's voice crackled over the fleet communication channel. General Chen, in 3 centuries of warfare against the Devourers, they have never attempted diplomatic contact with any coalition force. This could represent a significant strategic opportunity. Chen had studied the tactical display showing the approaching bioform for nearly a minute before responding. Admiral, what's your assessment of the possibility that this is some form of biological weapon or infiltration attempt? Our sensors indicate the vessel contains only a single life form, approximately human-sized, with no detectable weapon systems or hostile biotechnology. Very well. We'll receive that diplomat in Conference Bay 3, with full security protocols and biological containment procedures. General, Major Rodriguez had interjected with obvious concern. Standard procedure for unknown alien contact requires. Major, there is no standard procedure for this situation, Chen had interrupted. We're improvising. Again. What followed was perhaps the most surreal hour of Zex's military career. The Devourer diplomat, if that term could be applied to a creature whose species had never acknowledged the existence of diplomacy, turned out to be unlike anything any coalition force had previously encountered. Instead of the massive chitinous bioforms that served as Devourer warriors, the creature that emerged from the docking bay was roughly humanoid in size and shape, though its smooth grey-green surface suggested it had been specifically grown for this encounter. It moved with fluid grace rather than the aggressive urgency typical of its species. And when it spoke, the universal translators produced something that sounded almost like normal conversation. I am the designated interface for this discussion, it had said, settling into the conference room chair that had been hastily modified for its physiology. Your species presents complications that require direct consideration. General Chen had taken the seat directly across from the creature, flanked by Major Rodriguez and Commander Vashti from the Christine contingent. Zexe had been positioned with the security detail, close enough to observe but ready to act if the situation turned hostile. What kind of complications? Chen had asked with the same calm tone he used for routine tactical briefings. Your approach to conflict resolution does not match our behavioral models, the creature had replied. We consume resources, you preserve resources while consuming us. This creates mathematical paradoxes in our expansion calculations. You're having trouble understanding why we fight back. We are having trouble understanding why you fight forward. The creature's head tilted in what might have been confusion. Most species defend until their defensive capabilities are exhausted, then submit to consumption. Your species appears to use defensive situations as preparation for offensive operations. Chen had actually smiled at that. We're a stubborn species. When someone tries to eat us, we tend to take it personally. This personal response creates tactical unpredictability that interferes with efficient conquest operations. We came here to consume this facility and its defenders as part of our expansion into this sector. Instead, we have lost over 4,000 bioforms and gained nothing of strategic value. So you're here to negotiate terms? The creature had paused for what seemed like careful consideration. We are here to understand whether your species can be accommodated within our expansion parameters. Perhaps we can identify resource allocation that does not require your complete consumption. The silence that followed this statement was broken by Admiral Corrin's voice from the fleet. General, this could be an opportunity to establish peaceful coexistence with a species we've been at war with for centuries. But Chen's expression had grown distinctly colder as the implications became clear. You're offering to let some humans survive as long as we don't interfere with your consumption of everyone else. Essentially accurate. Your species demonstrates sufficient tactical capability to make conquest expensive. If you were to restrict your territorial claims to acceptable limits, we could restructure our expansion to avoid direct conflict. What would constitute acceptable limits? Analysis suggests your species could be contained within approximately 12 star systems, while maintaining sufficient resources for continued survival. All other sectors would be available for normal consumption operations. Zexai had watched Chen's face during this exchange and realized that the Devourer diplomat had made a critical error in calculation. They had correctly assessed human military capabilities, but they had completely misunderstood human psychology. That's an interesting offer, Chen had said, his voice carrying a tone that made Zex's carapace begin to perspire. I have a counterproposal. We are prepared to consider alternative resource allocation arrangements. Chen had leaned forward slightly, his hands folded on the conference table. You leave this system immediately and never return. You avoid all human settlements, all human shipping routes, and all star systems that humans might want to visit in the future. In exchange, we won't hunt you down and exterminate every single bioship in your fleet. The Devourer diplomat had gone completely still. Your proposal is not mathematically viable. You lack the numerical superiority necessary to implement such terms. Do we? Major Rodriguez, What's our current casualty exchange ratio with Devourer forces? Approximately 15 to 1 in our favor, sir. And how many bioships have attempted to flee our engagement zone over the past 4 days? 7 confirmed, sir. All were destroyed by Admiral Corrin's fleet while attempting to retreat. Chen had turned back to the diplomat with that terrifying human smile. The mathematics look fine from our perspective. You came here expecting easy prey. Instead, you found predators. The question isn't whether we can exterminate your fleet. The question is how long you want to keep paying the price to find out. The creature's surface had rippled with what the xenobiology texts described as extreme agitation. Your species cannot maintain this level of combat effectiveness indefinitely. Resource limitations will eventually require. Our species has been fighting wars for 10,000 years, Chen had interrupted. We've gotten very good at finding ways to continue when continuation should be impossible. More importantly, we've discovered that we enjoy it more than we probably should. That last statement had sent chills through Zexay's nervous system because he recognized the truth in it. Over the past 4 days, he had watched human forces not just adapt to combat, but thrive in it. They weren't enduring the battle. They were embracing it with enthusiasm that bordered on the pathological. I need to consult with the collective intelligence, the Devourer diplomat had said finally. Take all the time you need. We're not going anywhere. The creature had departed, and the waiting had begun. But instead of using the lull to rest and resupply, General Chen had done something that demonstrated just how thoroughly human thinking had infected the other coalition forces. All unit commanders, this is General Chen. While our visitors are considering their options, we're implementing Operation Thunderbolt. All available forces will conduct simultaneous raids against the 3 nearest Devourer bioships. Sir, Admiral Corrin's voice had carried sharp alarm. We're supposed to be engaged in diplomatic negotiations. Admiral, we are negotiating. We're just making sure our negotiating position is as clear as possible. What followed was the most audacious military operation Zexay had ever participated in. Instead of waiting defensively for the Devourer's decision, coalition forces launched coordinated attacks against enemy vessels that outmassed them by orders of magnitude. Not full-scale assault attempts, but precision strikes designed to inflict maximum damage while demonstrating capabilities the enemy hadn't yet experienced. Raid Team Alpha breaching Bioship Target 1, came the report from Commander Vashti, leading a mixed Christine human assault unit. Encountering heavy resistance but maintaining forward momentum. Raid Team Beta has successfully penetrated Target 2's exterior defenses, reported Captain Liu, commanding a predominantly human force, deploying explosive charges against critical biosystems. Raid Team Gamma requesting immediate extraction from Target 3, came the third report. Mission accomplished, but enemy response is escalating rapidly. All 3 raid teams had successfully penetrated Devourer bioships, caused significant internal damage, and extracted with minimal casualties. But the psychological impact was even more significant than the material damage. They had proven that coalition forces could take the fight directly to enemy capital vessels and win. The Devourers had been thinking of us as a defensive problem they needed to solve. Zexay told Dr. Yildara, his voice carrying remembered amazement. The raids demonstrated that we were actually an offensive threat they needed to contain. The therapist made notes while monitoring his stress indicators. How did this shift in tactical dynamics affect the diplomatic situation? The Devourer diplomat returned 6 hours later with a very different attitude. The creature that re-entered Conference Bay 3 showed signs of what xenobiologists called stress morphing. Its previously smooth surface was now covered with defensive ridges, and its movement patterns had become noticeably more agitated. The collective intelligence has reviewed your terms, it had announced without preamble. Your species demonstrates capabilities that were not included in our initial assessment parameters. Meaning? Chen had asked. Meaning your classification has been revised from prey species with defensive capabilities to predator species with expansion potential.
This requires
Alternative accommodation arrangements. I'm listening. Complete territorial separation. Your species maintains current holdings and expansion vectors. Our collective adjusts expansion patterns to avoid direct conflict zones. No resource sharing agreements, but no active hostility unless territorial boundaries are violated. Chen had considered this for nearly a minute before responding. That's better. But it's still not good enough. The creature's agitation had intensified visibly. Alternative terms? Complete withdrawal from this galactic sector. Find somewhere else to be. If we encounter Devourer forces anywhere in Coalition space, We'll assume you're violating our territorial agreements and respond accordingly. Your territorial claims cannot encompass an entire galactic sector. The mathematics are simple. This is where we live. We don't want neighbors who eat people. Find a different neighborhood. The silence that followed was broken only by the low hum of the station's life support systems. Zexhay had watched the Devourer diplomat process this ultimatum with growing fascination. The creature wasn't just angry or confused, it was genuinely attempting to understand how a numerically inferior species could make demands that violated every principle of realistic strategic planning. Your species appears to operate according to psychological parameters that do not accommodate standard conquest methodologies, the creature had finally said. Very well. Territorial withdrawal will be implemented. But understand that this accommodation is based on demonstrated combat effectiveness, not perceived moral authority.
We'll take it, Chen had replied.
Effectiveness is all we really care about anyway. The Devourer diplomat had departed for the final time, and within 12 hours the entire enemy fleet had vanished into hyperspace, leaving Thermopylae Station in Coalition hands. But victory came, with revelations that would haunt Zexhay for years afterward. We hadn't just won a battle, he told Dr. Yildara. We'd discovered something about ourselves that changed everything. The humans hadn't just taught us new tactics, they'd awakened something that had been dormant in all our species, something that made us more effective as warriors, but also something that made us more dangerous as people. The therapist leaned forward slightly. What do you mean? Zexhay felt his secondary arms begin to tremble again. I mean that by the end of the 4th day, I understood why the Devourers had been so disturbed by human behavior. We weren't just fighting to defend ourselves anymore. We were fighting because we had discovered that we were good at it. And that discovery was intoxicating. The 5th day at Thermopylae Station should have been a celebration. The Devourer fleet had withdrawn, the station was secure, and Coalition forces had achieved something unprecedented in galactic military history. They had not just repelled a superior enemy force, but had convinced them to abandon an entire sector of space. Instead, General Chen spent the morning walking through the station's corridors, observing his troops with an expression that Zexhay was learning to recognize as deeply troubled. The human soldiers were functioning normally by all standard measures. They performed their duties efficiently, followed orders promptly, and maintained proper military discipline. But something fundamental had changed in their demeanor. They moved with a predatory confidence that hadn't been there before the battle. They spoke in casual tones about combat techniques that would have horrified them a week earlier. Most disturbing of all, they seemed disappointed that the fighting had ended. Sir, the engineering teams are requesting permission to continue modifications to the station's defensive systems.
Major Rodriguez had reported during the morning briefing.
They've developed several innovative improvements during the siege that could be implemented permanently. What kind of improvements? Chen had asked. Primarily offensive systems disguised as infrastructure modifications, hidden weapons emplacements, corridor layouts that can be instantly reconfigured into kill zones, automated systems that can identify and eliminate intruders without direct human intervention. Rodriguez paused, consulting his datapad. They're calling it Fortress Protocol, a complete redesign that would turn any space station into a practically impregnable military installation. Chen had studied the engineering reports with that same troubled expression. Major, what's your assessment of our personnel's psychological state following the engagement? Sir, are our people looking forward to returning to normal duties, or are they hoping for another fight? Rodriguez had been quiet for several moments before answering. General, I think they're hoping for another fight. And frankly, sir, so am I. That admission had crystallized something that Chen had obviously been observing throughout the battle. The human approach to warfare wasn't just tactically effective. It was psychologically addictive. Once soldiers discovered that they could not just survive impossible odds but thrive under them, returning to peaceful routine became a form of deprivation. But the psychological changes weren't limited to human personnel. Zexhay had spent the morning conducting his own informal assessment of coalition forces, and what he found was disturbing. His Kethmoran warriors, traditionally disciplined and methodical in their approach to combat, were now requesting permission to volunteer for advanced reconnaissance patrols in areas where Devourer remnants might still be hiding. Christine units that normally required extensive coordination protocols were making independent tactical decisions and requesting authorization for autonomous hunter-killer operations. Most alarming of all were the reports from the Void Singers. The normally pacifistic species had not only adapted to aggressive combat roles, but several individuals were requesting permanent transfer to frontline military units.
Commander Zexhay, Harmony of Deep Spaces. One of the Void Singer participants had approached him during the post-battle assessment.
I wish to discuss potential career modification options. What kind of modifications? Zexhay had asked, though he suspected he already knew the answer. I have discovered capabilities during the recent engagement that were not addressed in my previous occupational classifications. I believe I could serve the Coalition more effectively in a permanent military capacity. You're requesting transfer from cultural arts to combat operations? I am requesting opportunity to develop the tactical abilities I discovered while working with human military units. The experience of coordinated combat operations was professionally satisfying in ways I had not anticipated. Zexhay had received similar requests from representatives of every species that had participated in the battle. Not just requests for continued military service, but requests for assignment to the most dangerous and challenging combat roles available. It was as if the entire multinational force had been infected with human attitudes toward warfare. We were becoming something new, Zexhay told Dr. Doe. Yildara, his voice dropping to barely above a whisper. Not just better soldiers, but beings who preferred conflict to peace, who found combat more engaging than the civilized pursuits we had been fighting to protect. The therapist made extensive notes while monitoring his vital signs. How did General Chen respond to these developments? That was perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the entire situation. Instead of being pleased that coalition forces had developed enhanced combat effectiveness, Chen had seemed genuinely worried about the psychological transformation he had helped create.
All unit commanders report to the main conference room at 1400 hours, Chen had announced over the station's communication system.
We need to discuss what happens next. The meeting that followed was unlike any military briefing Zexhay had ever attended. Instead of discussing tactical assessments or strategic planning, Chen had addressed the fundamental question of what coalition forces had become during their 6 days of combat. Ladies, gentlemen, and beings of various classifications, Chen had begun. We need to talk about what we've learned about ourselves during this engagement.
Sir, are you referring to tactical innovations or strategic capabilities? Commander Vashti had asked.
I'm referring to the fact that everyone in this room has discovered that they enjoy warfare more than they should. Chen had looked around the conference table, meeting each commander's gaze directly. We've learned that we're capable of fighting against impossible odds and winning. We've learned that we can adapt to any tactical situation and overcome any challenge. And most importantly, we've learned that we find this process satisfying. The uncomfortable silence that followed confirmed that Chen had identified something none of them had wanted to acknowledge. General, enhanced combat effectiveness is surely a positive development for coalition military capabilities, Admiral Corrin had observed from the fleet communication channel. Our personnel have developed skills and confidence that will serve them well in future engagements.
Admiral, that's exactly what worries me, Chen had replied.
We've created soldiers who are hoping for future engagements, and that creates a psychological dynamic that could be more dangerous to galactic peace than the Devourers ever were. Zexhay had felt his carapace begin to perspire as the implications became clear. Military forces that preferred conflict to peace had a tendency to find reasons for conflict, regardless of political or diplomatic considerations. They had become the kind of warriors that civilian populations needed protection from, not just protection by. What do you recommend, General? Zexhay had asked. Chen had been quiet for several moments before responding. I recommend that we acknowledge what we've become, accept that we can't go back to what we were before, and figure out how to manage these new capabilities responsibly.
Meaning?
Meaning we need to create institutional structures that channel our newfound love of combat in directions that serve galactic peace rather than threatening it. We need to become professional warriors in the truest sense, beings who are capable of incredible violence but choose to use it only when absolutely necessary. What followed was a series of conversations that would reshape coalition military doctrine for generations. Instead of trying to suppress or ignore the psychological changes that human combat methods had created, they began developing frameworks for managing warrior cultures within peaceful civilizations. The solution they eventually developed was both elegant and disturbing. Coalition forces that had been infected with human combat psychology would be organized into specialized units that would be deployed only against existential threats to galactic peace. They would train constantly, maintain peak combat readiness, and be kept geographically separated from civilian populations except during actual military operations. We were creating a warrior class, Zexhay told Dr. Yildara. Beings who lived for combat but served peaceful societies. It solved the immediate problem of managing our psychological changes, but it also created new problems that we're still dealing with. What kind of problems? The problem of beings who are no longer entirely compatible with the civilizations they protect. We can defend galactic peace, but we can no longer truly participate in it. We've become too dangerous, too focused on conflict resolution through violence, too comfortable with the psychology of warfare. The therapist leaned back in her chair, reviewing her extensive notes. Is that why you're here, Commander? Because you can no longer integrate with peaceful society? Zexhay felt his mandibles click with bitter amusement.
I'm here because I've been having nightmares for 2 years.
But not nightmares about the horrors of combat or the trauma of violence. I'm having nightmares about how much I enjoyed it. How natural it felt. How much I want to experience it again. The admission hung in the air between them like a confession of some fundamental betrayal. Zexhay had spent his entire adult life serving as a protector of civilization, but 6 days of fighting alongside humans had revealed that he was capable of becoming something that civilization needed protection from. The humans didn't just teach us new tactics, he continued. They taught us something about the nature of warfare that our species had never understood. They taught us that combat isn't just about survival or duty or protecting what you value. For some beings, under certain circumstances, it's about discovering what you're truly capable of when all limitations are removed. And that discovery troubles you? That discovery terrifies me because it felt like coming home. The final hours at Thermopylae Station had been spent in a strange mixture of celebration and mourning. They had achieved an impossible victory, but the cost wasn't measured in casualties or equipment damage. The cost was the loss of innocence, the comfortable assumption that they were fundamentally peaceful beings who engaged in warfare only when forced to by circumstance. General Chen had made the final log entry for the engagement, and his words had become part of official coalition military doctrine. We came to Thermopylae Station to defend a fuel depot. We learned that we are capable of becoming something that the galaxy has never seen before. A coalition of species that can coordinate effectively in combat and find satisfaction in the process. This capability is simultaneously our greatest military asset and our greatest potential threat to galactic peace. Future commanders should remember that the power to defend civilization includes the power to dominate it. 2 years later, sitting in Dr. Yildara's office, Zexhay finally understood what Chen had been trying to warn them about. The humans didn't just save the station, he told the therapist. They saved us all by teaching us how to fight effectively. But in the process, they also doomed us to become beings who will always prefer the clarity of combat to the ambiguity of peace. Do you regret the experience? Zexhay was quiet for a long time before answering. I regret that it ended. And that's exactly why I'm here. Dr. Yildara made her final notes and closed the session file. Commander, I think you're ready to return to active duty. But I also think you now understand why warrior classes in every civilization throughout history have struggled with the transition from war to peace. Because once you discover what you're truly capable of in combat, everything else feels like a pale imitation of life. Because once you learn to thrive under impossible circumstances, normal circumstances feel impossible to thrive under.